What if everything we've been told about the War of 1812 misses the most crucial detail? What if this conflict wasn't really about maritime disputes, territorial expansion, or even national honor? What if it was something far more calculated, a systematic dismantling of an entire way of life that stood in the path of emerging power structures? We find ourselves in the opening decades of the 19th century, an age balanced precariously between old certainties and revolutionary change. Monarchies still claimed authority through ancient bloodlines, yet the spirit of upheaval moved through every court and capital. Military technology had advanced dramatically. State bureaucracies expanded rapidly, and the tools of large-scale warfare had become more devastating than previous generations could have imagined. The standard historical account presents the War of 1812 as a tangled mess of competing interests. France battling Britain, Russia confronting France, the fledgling United States dragged into conflicts between European giants. The players are well documented, their stated motivations appear transparent, and the results sit neatly organized in history textbooks. But when we examine the record more carefully, when we look beyond the surface narrative, something deeply troubling begins to emerge. Two towering figures dominate this era like gravitational forces, pulling the world between them. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican general who crowned himself emperor and redrew Europe's map through unrelenting military campaigns, and Alexander I, the Russian Tsar who positioned himself as both Napoleon's adversary and Europe's moral compass. On the surface, they were enemies. Their forces met in brutal combat, their ambassadors engaged in bitter diplomacy, and their nations hemorrhaged resources and lives. Yet when we examine their actions more closely, a peculiar mirror image appears. The War of 1812, whether observed through European battlefields or the simultaneous American conflict, proceeds according to strange logic. Enormous resources get expended, vast territories suffer complete devastation, populations simply vanish from historical records, and when the fighting finally stops, the political landscape has shifted, but not in ways that correspond to the catastrophic destruction and death toll. Winners seem uncertain, losers appear oddly intact. This is where our investigation truly begins. The conventional narrative insists that Napoleon's 1812 invasion of Russia represented catastrophic overreach, imperial arrogance crushed by winter, vast distances, and supply chain collapse. Similarly, it portrays Alexander I as simply enduring, withdrawing, and eventually prevailing through sheer persistence. Yet this explanation cannot adequately account for Russia's deliberate obliteration of its own cities, Moscow's eerie evacuation, or the almost ceremonial quality of the destruction that followed. These weren't accidents, they were deliberate decisions. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the War of 1812 between Britain and the United States mirrors these same contradictions. Military goals remain murky, important cities burn without producing lasting advantage. Peace treaties restore boundaries almost precisely to their pre-war positions. For a conflict that mobilized imperial resources on such scale, the tangible results feel strangely hollow. So we must pose a question that conventional history rarely considers. Who were these emperors actually fighting against? To understand why this matters, we need to examine the deeper currents flowing through this period. The early 1800s weren't simply an age of warfare, they were an age of erasure. Ancient craft guilds disappeared, regional independence dissolved, entire economic frameworks built on local production and community organization were quietly torn apart and replaced with centralized, state-controlled systems. Historic cities underwent complete reconstruction, archival records vanished, traditional ways of organizing society melted into silence, and this transformation occurred with remarkable speed. Can it be mere coincidence that history's most destructive early modern wars specifically targeted regions where older, decentralized systems still functioned? Could the real enemy have been not another empire, but an alternative model of social organization, one that no centralized power could permit to survive? This isn't a claim we advance carelessly. It's a hypothesis that emerges only when we take the anomalies seriously, when casualty numbers don't align with military outcomes, when scorched earth tactics appear less strategic than surgical, when alliances shift not along ideological principles, but along patterns of consolidation and control. Viewed through this lens, the War of 1812 begins to look like something entirely different. Not an error, not a communications breakdown, but a coordinated transformation that required chaos as its primary tool. As we continue, we'll trace the accepted historical record meticulously, step by step. We'll note the dates, follow the troop movements, and examine the voices preserved in official documents. But we'll also pay close attention to what those documents avoid, what they downplay, and what they never adequately explain. Because sometimes the most significant truths aren't locked in secret vaults. They hide in plain sight, buried under repetition, familiarity, and our comfortable assumption that we already understand how our modern world came to be. The deeper we investigate the War of 1812, the more it resembles a doorway, one that history opened momentarily, then quickly sealed shut. Behind that door lies a question that refuses silence. If Napoleon and Alexander weren't simply destroying each other, then what or who were they actually eliminating? That question requires us to circle back to the accepted historical narrative, and that's where we must venture next, to understand why the War of 1812 appears so peculiar under close examination. We need to walk through the version of events that history considers established fact. This forms the foundation, the official framework of explanation upon which all other interpretations are constructed. By the early 19th century, Europe had already endured exhaustion. Over a decade of nearly continuous conflict had redrawn borders, toppled royal houses, and transformed entire populations into military societies. At the center of this maelstrom stood Napoleon Bonaparte, whose campaigns spanning from Italy to Egypt and across Central Europe had fundamentally altered the rules of continental power dynamics. By 1807, having crushed Prussia and compelled Russia to negotiate, Napoleon seemed unstoppable. That year brought the Treaty of Tilsit, where Napoleon and Alexander I met face to face. According to standard history, this encounter marked temporary reconciliation. France and Russia, previously adversaries, agreed to cooperation. Russia would join Napoleon's continental system, an economic blockade intended to strangle Britain by severing its access to European markets. In exchange, Napoleon acknowledged Russian interests in Eastern Europe. On paper, this was pragmatic negotiation between two emperors dividing spheres of influence. In practice, it proved profoundly unstable. The continental system demanded sacrifices that cut directly into Russia's economic vitality. British goods continued entering through smuggling routes. Russian aristocracy resented French dominance. Napoleon, meanwhile, grew increasingly suspicious of Alexander's genuine commitment. By 1810, the relationship had visibly deteriorated. By 1811, war became inevitable. This brings us to the traditional narrative's sharpest focus. In June 1812, Napoleon launched what historians often describe as the largest military invasion the world had witnessed. The Grande Armée, more than 600,000 soldiers drawn from across Europe, marched eastward into Russian territory. The scale alone staggers comprehension. Men from France, Poland, Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and beyond moved as a unified force, consuming staggering quantities of provisions, horses, ammunition, and equipment. The stated objective appeared straightforward: compel Russia back into compliance.
Yet almost immediately the campaign diverged from expectations. Rather than engaging Napoleon in decisive battle near the frontier, Russian forces retreated. They withdrew progressively deeper into their own territory, abandoning towns, agricultural land, and infrastructure. Crops were set ablaze, wells poisoned, entire regions systematically emptied. This approach, later termed scorched earth, is typically explained as desperate strategy to deny Napoleon resources while buying time. Yet even at this early stage, something feels wrong. Retreat on this magnitude required planning, coordination, willingness to sacrifice civilian populations and settlements centuries old. This wasn't chaos, it was methodical. By September 1812, Napoleon reached Moscow, the symbolic heart of Russia. According to every expectation of early modern warfare, this should have represented triumph. Capitals fell.
The burning of Moscow is often framed as patriotic sacrifice. But cities aren't just symbols, they're repositories. Archives, guild halls, workshops, libraries, and religious institutions concentrate memory. When a city burns, records burn with it. Legal precedents vanish, property claims dissolve, traditions lose their anchors. The destruction of Moscow functioned like a reset. And it wasn't unique. Across Europe, Napoleonic campaigns repeatedly resulted in dissolution of local institutions. In Italy, Germany, and parts of Central Europe, centuries-old arrangements were swept away and replaced with standardized administrative units. Napoleon's Napoleonic Code was exported not merely as law, but as ideology, one that subordinated local custom to centralized authority. Here is where the pattern sharpens. Russia, ostensibly Napoleon's enemy, emerges from 1812 moving in the same direction. Alexander I, far from restoring pre-war autonomy, accelerates centralization. Serfdom tightens, bureaucracy expands. The imperial state grows more uniform, not less. The very methods Napoleon imposed elsewhere appear mirrored within Russia after his defeat. Enemies, it seems, were learning from one another. Now widen the lens. Across the Atlantic, the War of 1812 performs a similar function. The burning of Washington, D.C., while militarily questionable, obliterates early federal records and disrupts a fragile administrative center. The war's aftermath strengthens federal authority within the United States, weakens regional dissent, and accelerates consolidation of national identity over local allegiance. Different continents, different flags, same outcome. This brings us to the timeline. The years between 1807 and 1815 form a tight cluster of transformative events. The Treaty of Tilsit establishes temporary cooperation. The invasion of Russia follows. Napoleon falls, and immediately afterward, Europe's rulers gather at the Congress of Vienna. The Congress is remembered as a peace conference, a restoration of balance after chaos. But restoration is misleading. What actually occurred was reorganization. Borders were redrawn with little regard for local identities. Dynasties were reinstated under new rules. Surveillance of populations increased. The concept of legitimacy shifted away from tradition and toward international consensus among elites. Most tellingly, the Congress locked in the destruction already accomplished by war. Regions that had been devastated weren't rebuilt as they were absorbed, standardized, and managed. War cleared the ground, diplomacy claimed it. At this point, we must ask whether the devastation itself was the objective. Consider the logistics again. The Grande Armée wasn't simply defeated by winter. It was allowed to advance deep into Russia, far beyond sustainable supply lines. This was known. Russian commanders understood geography and climate intimately. The decision to retreat rather than engage early ensured that the French army would traverse and consume vast swaths of territory before collapsing. From one perspective, this is defensive brilliance.
From another, its controlled demolition. Napoleon's army functioned like a moving furnace, stripping regions of resources before being extinguished. The land was left empty, population scattered, infrastructure ruined. The invader was destroyed, but so was much of what lay in his path. Who benefited from that outcome? Not the peasants, not the local merchants, not the autonomous towns. The beneficiaries were centralized states, which could now rebuild these regions according to new models, models that favored taxation, conscription, and bureaucratic oversight. The hypothesis. At a certain point in any investigation, the fragments on the table stop behaving like fragments. They begin pulling toward one another, locking into place with quiet inevitability. The picture that emerges isn't always comfortable, but it's coherent. All these clues point to one almost unbelievable conclusion. The War of 1812 was not primarily a war between Napoleon and Alexander, nor between Britain and the United States. It was a synchronized elimination of an older social and economic order, one that threatened the consolidation of modern imperial power. In this light, Napoleon Bonaparte and Alexander I appear less like mortal enemies and more like rival surgeons operating on the same patient. To understand this hypothesis, we must name what was being removed. Across Europe and parts of North America before 1800, vast regions still functioned through